Hello, everybody. Welcome to Brandon's Haunted Library. My name is Brandon, your undead librarian, and I read and talk about fantasy, literary fiction, and of course, horror. Thank you for choosing my video. Hope you stick around because today I'll be filling you in on everything I read in the months of August, September, and October. It's been a minute since I've given you all a wrap up, so this one might be a long one. So over the past few months, I've read a total of 16 books. And in terms of genres, I read a lot of horror, of course, especially in October, but I also read some sci-fi, crime thrillers, and literary fiction. I'll talk about each in order of my favorites from the months, starting with my least favorite and ending with my favorites. First up, let's talk about Aliens Phalanx by Scott Sigler. I'm a big fan of the Alien movie universe, and earlier this year I read Alien the Cold Forge by Alex White and was blown away by that one. So I decided to read another one of the Alien novels in the extended universe, and going into Aliens Phalanx, I was curious how Scott Sigler would tackle this universe. And while I really did like the concept here, I didn't think it worked nearly as well as the Cold Forge did for me. The big hook is the setting. Instead of the usual futuristic space horror, Sigler throws the xenomorphs into a medieval-style world where humans live in fortified cities to protect themselves from the xenomorph infestations on their planets. It's swords and shields versus xenomorphs, and on paper, it sounds really awesome. The story follows Ahalia, our young heroine who dreams of becoming a runner, venturing beyond the walls to scavenge supplies and face the creatures in the wild. When she discovers what these demons actually are, things shift into classic alien action horror territory, intense, survival driven, and gory. But honestly, it was a bit of a slog getting there for me. The pacing drags, and the dialogue is pretty rough, full of immature profanity that feels more juvenile than anything, like trying to be edgy for the sake of being edgy. I actually had to double check Goodreads after finishing because this book has a 4.2 star rating, and I just don't quite get it. It's creative, sure, but the writing and tone kept pulling me out of the story. The final act is strong and delivers that adrenaline-fueled climax the series is known for, but overall, Phalanx felt more like an interesting attempted experiment than a successful novel. A cool idea, unevenly executed, which I gave 2.5 stars. Next up, let's talk about Black Sheep by Rachel Harrison. I've been a fan of Rachel Harrison for a bit. Her book, Such Sharp Teeth, ranked as one of my favorite horror books I read last year. And even So Thirsty scratched a similar feminist horror itch that Harrison does so well. So I went into Black Sheep really optimistic, but unfortunately this one didn't quite land for me. The story follows Vesper, a young woman who's been estranged from her deeply religious family for years. And by religious, I mean Satanism. One day she receives an invitation to her cousin's wedding, one which she never expected to be asked to attend, so she reluctantly decides to go back home to attend. From there, the story builds around that uncomfortable reunion and dysfunctional family wedding energy. I won't spoil the big reveal at the halfway point, but I will say it took the book in a direction that felt a bit predictable. I think it was meant to bring in the horror element of the story, but for me, it just made me roll my eyes a little bit. I think Harrison was going for a mix of religious horror and dark comedy, which in a way it did pull off, but I wanted more from a great writer like Rachel Harrison. The family dynamics, which could have been rich and messy, felt more like broad sketches, which is surprising because I've enjoyed her character developments and relationships in a lot of her other books. That said, Harrison's writing is still fun to read. She has this conversational and irreverent voice that makes her books really enjoyable to read. Even when I wasn't scared or surprised, I was never bored. Black Sheep isn't a bad book, just one that didn't deliver the bite I was hoping for. Enjoyable, but ultimately underwhelming, and I gave it 2.5 stars. Next up is one of my most anticipated reads of the year, an anthology called The End of the World as We Know It, New Tales of Stephen King's The Stand. I read The Stand pretty recently for the first time, so a new anthology revisiting that world with stories from some of today's biggest horror names was immediately intriguing to a King fan like myself. It's a collection of short stories set in Stephen King's post-apocalyptic America, where the superflu has wiped out most of humanity and what's left is this moral and spiritual battleground between good and evil. I definitely do not recommend this to anyone who hasn't already read The Stand. Overall, I enjoyed it, but it's a bit of a mixed bag. Seeing different authors, some of my favorite contemporary horror writers, bring their own voices to the bleak setting and atmosphere of The Stand was really cool. Some stories really stood out to me. Nat Cassidy's piece was outside of the box and really fun to read with some interesting connections to the original Stand and changes made in the extended cut from the 1990s. Catriona Ward's story took the perspective of a dog in a zoo, and I really enjoyed that one. I also found myself really enjoying contributions from Joe R. Lansdale and C. Robert Cargill. The best stories in this collection expand on the world of the original without feeling like fan fiction. But that said, a lot of these stories did blur together. There's a repetitive tone across the collection, and after a while it starts to feel a little redundant. It's not that any one story is offensively bad, but some just weren't very good and too many hit the same emotional notes. Still, if you're a fan of The Stand, it's worth picking up just to see how other writers interpret that apocalyptic mythology. Familiar but not essential. I ranked all the stories in this collection and it all averaged out to about 3 stars. Next up is Authority, which is the second book in Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach series. I absolutely loved Annihilation as one of the best books I've read in a while, and it stuck with me long after I finished. In particular, the ending really stuck with me. So going into Authority, the second book in the series, my expectations were pretty high, though tampered by the fact that I know a lot of people don't like this story nearly as much as Annihilation. And while I did enjoy it, I'll admit, it didn't quite recapture the magic of the first one for me either. Authority shifts gears completely. Instead of the surrealist environmental horror of Annihilation, we're suddenly in the bureaucratic office space world of the Southern Reach organization itself, the people trying to study and control Area X. Our main character, nicknamed Control, is the new director brought in to clean up the mess left behind by the previous administration. He's trying to understand who he can trust in the Southern Reach and what exactly is Area X. It's a fascinating setup, but also a frustrating one because we barely get any clarity or answers. The pacing here drags. A lot of the story is office politics, cryptic messages, and Control's slow unraveling as he tries to make sense of the mysteries. There are flashes of brilliance. Vandermeer's writing is vivid and hypnotic as ever, but the tension that made Annihilation so great just isn't here in the same way. It's not as instantly satisfying as Annihilation, but I respect what Vandermeer is doing. It's bold, strange, and uncompromising. Overall, I'd call this one a beautifully written slow burn that I admired more than I loved. I gave Authority by Jeff Vandermeer 3 stars. Next, I picked up The Compound by Aisling Rawle during the reality TV binge in the midst of the latest Love Island season, and honestly, that timing couldn't have been better. The book feels like Love Island meets Lord of the Flies through a Black Mirror lens. It takes the performative, glossy world of reality dating shows and pushes it to a dystopian extreme. The concept is great. 10 men and 10 women are isolated inside a compound to film a high-stakes dating show where they couple up, do challenges, and win prizes to survive safely within the compound. And of course, the production is shady and is manipulating everything and are free to dish out punishment and humiliation in the name of ratings. I've always thought of reality TV as kind of dystopian, but after reading this, I'm honestly viewing all these dating shows a lot differently. Rawle uses the story to explore how gender, sexuality, and desires are packaged and sold, how people are turned into brands, and sexuality becomes a product. There's a pointed commentary on consumerism and capitalism, though I would say some of the commentary is clunky and heavy-handed. The characters, too, could have used some more depth, as they sometimes feel more like archetypes rather than real people. Still, at around the halfway point, it really hooked me. I started thinking about it constantly, and by the last third, I couldn't put it down. The atmosphere and the sheer weirdness of it all was just so gripping to me. I just wish the ending landed a bit harder. It's a smart, thought-provoking book that comes so close to being great, but still a solid 3 stars for me. Earlier this year, I read Gabino Iglesias' House of Bone and Raid, and it completely blew me away. Beautifully written, violent, and full of raw human emotion. The characters felt so real, and the prose was just stunning. So naturally, I was eager to go back and read one of his earlier novels, The Devil Takes You Home. And while I did really enjoy it, it just didn't hit me the same way. This one follows Mario, a man whose life completely unravels after his daughter is diagnosed with leukemia, and they're buried under medical debt. Desperate, he takes a job as a hitman, descending deeper and deeper into violence and crime, a story that blends cartel brutality with supernatural horror. And on paper, that's the kind of story I really love. A gritty noir crime thriller with horror elements. And there's a lot to admire here. The atmosphere is there, the violence is visceral, and Iglesias' sharp social commentary on race and poverty is all there too. But in execution, it didn't quite reach the same level as House of Bone and Rain for me. The biggest issue for me was Mario's transformation. His descent from grieving father to cold-blooded killer just didn't feel fully convincing. The emotional beats were there, the heartbreak, the rage, but the arc itself felt a little rushed, almost implausible. Still, even when it's not perfect, Iglesias' writing always has this rhythm and intensity that keeps me hooked, a kind of brutal poetry that is uniquely his. So while The Devil Takes You Home didn't move me quite like House of Bone and Rain, it's still a dark, powerful read that proves Iglesias is one of the most exciting voices in modern horror and crime fiction. I gave it 3.5 stars. Next up is the newest release from Stephen Graham Jones, and if you know me, you know I'm a huge fan of his. His newest release, Killer on the Road and The Babysitter Lives, is a flip book. 2 separate novellas printed back to back, and both are steeped in his signature approach to the slasher genre. Of the two, Killer on the Road is a standout for me. It's a twisted, bloody road trip story that plays with classic hitchhiker tropes in a really creative way. The villain is disgusting and weirdly fascinating, the kills are gnarly, and the final girl is a total badass. It's an adrenaline-filled page-turner, and after finishing it, I'll definitely never look at wheel-lifting tow trucks the same again. I'd give Killer on the Road around 4 to 4.5 stars, just pure gross slasher fun done really well. The Babysitter Lives, on the other hand, didn't quite land as hard for me. I liked the haunted house concept and the atmosphere. Jones plays around with a lot of horror tropes here, twisting them in clever ways, but the story itself drags in places. It's convoluted at times, almost too dreamlike, making it a little hard to follow for me. That said, the fever dream tone does pay off by the end, which goes completely off the rails in the best possible way. I'd probably give this one 3 stars, but overall, this collection is a blast. Killer on the Road is easily worth the price of admission, and even though The Babysitter Lives didn't fully click for me, the combo makes for a creative, bloody, and entertaining read. 3.5 stars overall. Next up is A Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson, which I read for my most recent episode of Silver Scream to Broken Spines, covering book recommendations for Robert Eggers' The Witch. The story follows Emmanuelle, a young woman living in a rigid, puritanical community of Bethel, a place ruled by fear and brutal gender hierarchies. Her mother was once disgraced for breaking the prophet's sacred laws, and Emmanuelle has lived her whole life under the shadow of that shame. One day she wanders into the forbidden Darkwood, a forest haunted by spirits and witches who were executed generations ago. There she encounters these spirits and receives her mother's diary filled with eerie drawings and one haunting refrain: blood, blight, darkness, and slaughter. It's such a strong opening. The first third of the book absolutely nails the tone and the atmosphere. The isolation of Bethel and the dark atmosphere of the Darkwood all creates this oppressive and gothic mood that I loved. Around the halfway mark of the story, it shifts gears and the pacing quickens, and it starts to feel more like a dark fantasy novel than pure horror, which is definitely not a bad thing, as I did really enjoy this. It was just a bit different than I was expecting. While the tone lightens, the writing at times also edges into young adult territory, which I didn't love. Still, Henderson's world building is excellent, and the themes of religious corruption, inherited sin, and feminine resistance are all compelling. It's not a perfect novel, but it is a vivid and imaginative one. A solid 3.5 stars for me. Next up, The Troop by Nick Cutter. This is one of those horror novels that goes straight for the jugular, and I do mean that almost literally. It's gruesome, visceral, and has a lot of gross body horror. Normally, I need a bit more from my horror: tension, atmosphere, that slow burn dread you know I love. But this book manages to pull off shock value horror in a way that really worked for me. The setup is simple and effective. A group of teenage Boy Scouts and their scoutmaster take a camping trip to Prince Edward's Islands off the coast of Canada when a sick, emaciated stranger walks into their camp. From there, everything unravels fast. What follows is grotesque survival horror that feels like Lord of the Flies meets John Carpenter's The Thing. Cutter leans hard into the gore. This book is not for the squeamish, but is also surprisingly well constructed. The pacing is tight and the stakes escalate constantly. Some of the characters are pretty clear archetypes, but the ones I connected with felt the most real enough to carry the story. Their fear, their desperation, and even their cruelty all feels disturbingly real. What makes the troop work is how unflinching it is. It's not subtle, it's not elegant, it's nasty and relentless, and yet it's one of the few gore-heavy horror novels that, for me, still manages to feel thoughtful in its construction. It's not the kind of horror that I would usually gravitate towards, necessarily, but I have to admit the troop delivers exactly what it promises: a brutal and unforgettable ride. 4 stars. Earlier this year, I read Julia Armfield's Our Wives Under the Seas, and it completely floored me. One of my favorite reads of the year. After reading this, her 2024 novel, Private Rights, jumped near the top of my list. After reading it, I can say it's a strong follow-up, though not quite as perfect as Our Wives Under the Sea was. Armfield once again blends horror, melancholy, and literary fiction in such an elegant way. This time, the story takes place in a near-future world that's slowly collapsing under the weight of constant torrential rain and flooding. Society hasn't quite ended, but everyone seems to have accepted that the end is quietly coming. But life just continues. People still go to work, keep their routines, and live life even as the world falls apart around them. The novel centers on 3 sisters with a distant and contemptuous relationship who are reunited in the death of their father, a world-famous architect who designed their family a glass house uniquely prepared for the climate disaster they lived through. One of my favorite parts of this book are these interludes told from the perspective of the city itself, a collective voice describing how urban life persists in the ruins of this apocalyptic reality. Thematically, it reminded me a lot of life during the 2020 pandemic, that strange mix of fear, numbness, and quiet resignation. Armfield captures that feeling perfectly, and her prose is once again stunning, vivid, lyrical, and full of striking metaphors. You can feel her horror sensibilities underneath the surface, and here they're used to explore love, loss, and the slow-motion tragedy of watching the world fall apart. It's surprisingly a slower, more wandering book than Our Wives Under the Sea, a book some criticize as boring for this reason, and at times it feels almost aimless with Private Rights, but by the end, it really hits hard. The conclusion is shocking, powerful, and deeply moving. A beautifully written, slow burn apocalypse that I gave 4 stars. Next up is When Darkness Loves Us by Elizabeth Engstrom. I picked this up because it's part of Grady Hendrix's and Valancourt Books' Paperbacks from Hell series, which republishes weird, forgotten horror gems from the 70s and 80s. It includes 2 novellas, When Darkness Loves Us and Beauty Is, and both are really distinct, unsettling, and surprisingly emotional for what I would expect from Paperbacks from Hell. The first story, When Darkness Loves Us, completely blew me away. It's off the wall in the best way, claustrophobic, eerie, and genuinely scary for me at times. The atmosphere is incredible, especially considering that so much of this story takes place in total darkness. Since it's such a short story that's best going in blind, I won't say anything about the plot, but you can really feel the suffocating blackness pressing in around the main character. The plot twists are shocking, and the ending just floored me. It's strange and horrifying all at once, easily my favorite of the 2. The second story, Beauty Is, takes a very different tone. It's less traditional horror and more tragic, focusing on a woman named Martha who's isolated and mistreated by those around her. It's actually pretty heartbreaking, and it's hard not to empathize with her. I do want to note that there is repeated use of derogatory terms to describe her mental state, and there are also depictions of abuse. So that's something to be aware of if those subjects are triggering to you. But despite that, Engstrom handles the alternating timeline really effectively for a novella-length story, weaving past and present together in ways that feel seamless and purposeful. Both novellas showcase Engstrom's originality and her ability to balance beauty and horror. Her writing is lyrical and haunting, the kind of prose that lingers with you. I gave these two haunting and beautifully written nightmares 4 stars. Next up is Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melancour. I thought this was incredible, but it's hard to say that I enjoyed it. And honestly, I don't know who I would recommend it to. If you're drawn to authors like Truman Capote or Roberto Bolaño, maybe you'll find something here to appreciate. It's marketed as horror, but it's horrific in ways that I would not normally associate with the genre, probably because the horrors in here are not far from reality for some. The story begins with the discovery of a corpse, the body of a local woman known only as the Witch in a small village in rural Mexico. From there, we get a series of interconnected narratives, each chapter told from a different villager's perspective. Through these shifting voices, we slowly learn who the witch was and what brought about her death. But every voice reveals more of the ugliness and desperation that lives beneath the surface. Addiction, poverty, misogyny, and the emptiness they leave behind. The novel made me deeply uncomfortable, and that's very clearly the point. Melancour's prose, and huge credit to the translator Sophie Hughes as well, is absolutely relentless. The entire book reads like a hurricane, long unbroken sentences that crash into one another, chapters without paragraphs, and an unrelenting rhythm. It's intense, exhausting, and brilliant in equal measure. Each character's voice feels raw and confessional, exposing the cycles of abuse, addiction, and despair that shape this community. It's horrific not because of witchcraft or anything supernatural, but because of how vividly it depicts real human cruelty. I completely understand why this is considered a modern Mexican masterpiece. The writing is astonishing, but it's also one of those books you almost don't want to keep reading, and yet morbid curiosity won't let you put the book down. A brutal and unflinching literary hurricane that I give 4 stars, but read at your own risk. Next is another book I read for my Silver Screams to Broken Spines video, Slewfoot by Brom. Slewfoot follows Abatha, a young English woman living in 1666 who was married into a strict Puritan community in colonial New England. When her husband dies unexpectedly, she's left isolated and vulnerable as her brother-in-law schemes to take her land. Abatha encounters an ancient horned spirit known as Slewfoot in the woods, and what begins as a story of survival slowly transforms into a tale of liberation, witchcraft, and vengeance as the town's paranoia and hypocrisy spiral out of control. Brom does an incredible job capturing the oppressive atmosphere of Puritan life. The language, customs, and worldview of the time are rendered with striking authenticity, immersing readers in a colonial American world. The sense of isolation Abatha feels creates a palpable tension throughout. What really sets Slewfoot apart, though, is how it balances historical folk horror with full-on dark fantasy. Brom brings the presence of evil to life, with the forest teeming with demons, spirits, and visceral imagery complemented by Brom's own stunning illustrations. Beneath the horror, Slewfoot is a story about a woman reclaiming her power in a world that wants to silence her. If you love folk horror, Slewfoot is an easy recommendation, a book I gave 4 stars. Next up is All the Sinners Bleed by S.A. Cosby, a gritty crime thriller. The book follows Titus Crown, the first black sheriff in a small town in Virginia, a town still haunted by the echoes of the Confederacy. A school shooting occurs and a beloved local teacher is murdered by one of his own former students, and the shooter is killed by the police during the arrest. The investigation into this event spirals into something much darker as Titus uncovers a string of child murders that may have some connection to a local church. Cosby portrays the setting in an uncomfortable authenticity. The fictional town feels like a microcosm of the modern South, haunted by its history, clinging to its traditions, and divided among racial and political lines. The depiction of far-right groups organizing protests to defend Confederate heritage feels disturbingly plausible, echoing real-world tensions that still persist today. Cosby doesn't exaggerate this ugliness, but rather portrays it honestly. You can feel the weight of the cultural climate on every page, and every interaction the townspeople have with Titus. Beyond its cultural insight, All the Sinners Bleed is just a damn good thriller. The pacing is relentless, action-packed, but emotionally grounded, making it a difficult book to put down. And Titus Crown is one of the most compelling protagonists I've encountered in crime fiction. His moral struggle, his grief, and his search for redemption gives the story real emotional weight. Cosby's writing is sharp and poetic in its grit, even a little sarcastic and humorous in moments. All the Sinners Bleed is both a gripping page-turner and a powerful reflection of America's haunted conscience. I gave it 4.5 stars. Another standout read for me this quarter was The Dead Zone by Stephen King. This one follows Johnny Smith, a schoolteacher whose life changes forever after a brutal car accident leaves him in a coma for over 4 years. When he wakes up, he discovers he has psychic abilities, one that lets him glimpse moments from people's past or future through touch. But this gift isolates him, forcing him to carry the unbearable burden of knowing the future. What really struck me about The Dead Zone is how human it feels. King takes a premise that could have been pure sci-fi spectacle and instead builds a deeply emotional story. What really struck me about The Dead Zone is how human it feels. King takes a premise that could have been pure sci-fi spectacle and instead builds a deeply emotional story about loss, fate, and the moral limits of doing the right thing. Johnny's loneliness and his sense of being out of sync with the world that's moved on without him while he was in a coma, those parts hit just as hard as any of the supernatural moments. Then there's Greg Stillson, the rising politician whose populist rage and violent charisma makes him one of King's most chilling villains precisely because he feels so real. The novel's political edge is an interesting one in how it explores how fear, manipulation, and self-righteousness can manipulate a community. This is some of Stephen King's writing at its best. The pacing is tight, the emotional core hits hard, and the horror or tension comes from choices ordinary people face when confronted with evil. The Dead Zone balances a pretty basic supernatural concept with a profoundly human story. Easily one of Stephen King's finest and most emotionally resonant works, I gave it 5 stars. And my favorite book of the month was a reread of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I did a dedicated video on this, which you should check out if you haven't yet. But obviously this is a 5-star book for me in my eyes, a timeless classic that I really think you should check out if you haven't read it yet. And that's all the books I've read these past few months. Thank you so much for hanging out and watching this whole video. If you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss my next video. But until next time, feel free to drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on any of these or whatever books you've been loving lately. As always, happy reading everyone, and I'll see you all in the next video.